What's up, hobby friends? In this video, we're going to be talking about layers in Photoshop. Now, layers is a very useful way to, especially in complex images, organize and present our information while keeping all of our separate elements easy and accessible for editing and modification. So if we imagine our Photoshop canvas, layers is essentially like having sheets of glass layered or stacked on top of one another that you can reorganize to hide or show. And layers will impact everything beneath them, depending on things like your transparency, any sort of layer effects, if we're doing sort of different blending modes, which we'll get into in future videos. Right now, what I want to be covering is just the basics of how to use layers, what layers are really good for, and that we can understand the layer menu. So in Photoshop, on the bottom right, we have our layers tab. And you can see that by default, Photoshop will open a background layer with a color of our choice. I think by default it's white. And you can see that it has a lock icon. It is locked. So what that means is that it's a base layer. We can't put anything beneath it. And while we can modify it, we can't erase it to become transparent. We can remove this lock by just double clicking it. And it turns it into a new layer, not a background layer that can then be edited. We can actually clear out all of the white to make it transparent. And we can create new layers and bring it above or below. When it's a locked background layer, it is the base layer. It is our absolute bottom layer that we cannot stack on top of anything else, I guess. So to create a new layer, we simply create this plus button on the bottom right. And you can see that there are several other buttons around it. The trash bin is, of course, to erase a layer or to delete a layer. And then the folder allows us to create a new group or layer group. And this is very useful when we want to organize multiple layers. And this allows us to hide or show groups of layers all at once, depending on how we want to organize our information and how we want to have our image set up. So we're going to create a new layer, and we're just going to create, I don't know, whatever, a red shape. So this object is at 100% fill, 100% opacity. And the layer itself is at 100% opacity and 100% fill. So what that means is that this is a completely solid object, and anything that we create below it is going to be hidden. So for example, let's create a new layer. We're going to pick a different color. Let's go, it's blue. So you can see that the blue layer is underneath the red layer. And because again, the red object is 100% solid, it's going to hide everything beneath it. Similarly, the blue is also a solid object, 100%, with the layer at 100%. So it too will also hide everything beneath it. So you can see that with our three different layers, because they're all at 100%, the layer on top is going to hide or obscure everything beneath it. So the red hides the blue and the green, and the blue hides the green. If we were to take a layer and adjust its opacity, so for example, I'm going to take this red layer and make its opacity 50%. We can now see that it's only hiding 50% of the blue. So it's getting this cool little gradient of a purple because the two colors are mixing together. Similarly, on top of the green, the red and the green are mixing and creating nearing brown, more on the green tone because the green is at 100%. If we also take our blue layer and make it 50% as well, it does the same thing. The purple, where it mixes with the red, it's not as strong of a color because they're now only mixing 50% of each color's value. And similarly, the blue and the green mixing together are creating an almost aqua color. But you can see now, because the red and the blue are also both at 50%, that those two colors are mixing with the green in the center where all three overlap. If we put all three of these layers into a group, all that really does is it helps us organize it. We can turn off the group at will. We can duplicate the group either by holding Alt and then dragging down to create a copy, or we can just literally drag the entire group folder into new layer and it'll duplicate for us. And we can do the same thing with new layers. We can duplicate them by either dragging the layer on top of the plus or holding Alt and then just dragging the layer down or up, depending on where we want to put it. We can also delete layers by selecting the layer and hitting the trash icon or dragging on top. So when it comes to adjusting the transparency or the opacity of a layer, there's actually 3 ways that we can go about doing this. So the first is by drawing transparently on a layer. Switch this to black. So I have my brush set at 50% opacity, and we're just going to drag it across. So you see that the actual brush stroke, even though the layer is at 100% opacity, because the brush is only laying at 50%, it's going to be a transparent layer effect. It's going to be overlapping on top of other objects and revealing them. Another way that we can adjust the opacity or transparency of a layer is by going into our layer menu and adjusting the opacity directly. So like I showed earlier, we can drop the opacity and it'll impact everything on top, everything on that layer essentially gets reduced. So you can see that if I put this layer at 50% opacity, this solid brush stroke is now at 50% opacity, but the brush strokes that we put down that were at 50% opacity are now even lighter. When we reduce the opacity of a layer, everything on that layer, including layer effects like drop shadows, strokes, etc., also get reduced. If we go to our fill in the layer menu and drop it down, initially it seems like it does the same thing, right? If we put fill at 50%, it turns the square to 50% opacity or transparency, which is very similar to what the opacity does. Oops. However, dropping the fill only reduces the drawn objects on the layer. It does not impact things like layer styles. We'll cover layer styles in depth in future videos, but very briefly I want to show you what they are. So double click a layer to bring up the menu. And let's say we just want to put a simple stroke. I'm going to make it black, make it fixed as visible on the outside. Cool. So we have this red square with a black stroke. When we reduce the opacity, you can see that the stroke, this layer style, gets reduced along with it. So opacity impacts everything on the layer. However, when we reduce the fill, it's only affecting the drawn object, so our red square. Any effect like this stroke that we have on the layer remains the same. And we can put this to 0% so the square becomes gone and it keeps our layer effect, our stroke on at 100%. And this is very useful for when we're doing more graphic elements, we're doing text, we want to add some cool outlines or embossing or any sort of detail work and be able to adjust that independently. And it gives us an extra level of control or granularity in how we control all the different elements within the layers. One last thing I want to cover with the layers is the idea of parenting or creating a parent layer. So right now we have our 3 layers, our 3 squares, red, blue, and green, and they're all separate. They're stacked on top of one another, and when I move them, they're still retaining, I guess you call their basic properties, but they're still visible as squares, and if I were to move them beyond, they don't really impact each other apart from hiding each other because they are stacked as layers. When we create what's called a parent layer, we're essentially having our base layer as almost a bounding space or as a separate workspace, and layers on top still behave separately, but they're bound within the confines of the parent layer. So it's easier just to show you what I mean. We have our 3 squares. We're going to create a new layer, and we're going to just make it black is fine with a square. With the 2 layers side by side or stacked on top of one another, if I hold Alt and hover my mouse in between the layers, it gives me this square and arrow that's telling me to parent the black layer to the red layer. So if I go ahead and click this, you can see that now the layer is bumped to the right, it's indented with an arrow beneath. And What it's telling me is that the black layer is now parented to the red layer. The red is our base, and the black is being adjusted or impacted by the base. Now what this does is it allows us to essentially create a bounding box using the elements on our parent layer, the red layer, and everything that is parented to it, stacked on top, is bound to the confines of this red box. If we were to create a new layer, and let's create a yellow, you can see that it's all bound to the red layer and the objects won't go beyond the bounds. We can unbind by hovering our mouse in between, holding Alt and clicking. And we can add existing layers to this parent object by just dragging them either in between, so it sandwiches and it becomes bound, or dragging on top, hovering our mouse in between both layers, holding Alt and then clicking. Now I like using parent layers, especially in more complex drawings and digital paintings, because it allows me to create a sort of a base image that essentially acts as a template. And I can non-destructively paint on top of it with these extra parented layers. And I can modify this base red layer to adjust the shape or to adjust the bounds while retaining all of the elements on top, all of these separate layers that have any sort of changes I've done in digital painting, any layer effects, without impacting the base parent layer. So if I move back to my base layer, for example, and I want to adjust the shape, I want to adjust the size. Let's say I want to make it bigger. All right, I'm dragging the square out, and you can see that as I change the base layer, none of these parented squares are changing. As I'm increasing the bounds, you can see that it's revealing more, or if I reduce the bounds, it's revealing less. If I were to paintbrush. And this is very useful when it comes to more complex renderings or digital drawings, when we want to be able to go back and forth in a way that we call non-destructive. It allows us to retain as much editing capabilities as we go further and further in our work. Essentially, it allows us to retain as much control over our image as possible without having to lock in or make changes permanent. And in Photopea, we can basically see the same functionality. When we create a new image, the first layer is a background layer that is locked. We can double click and it doesn't seem to remove that lock. We can create layers and it functions very much the same as in Photoshop, where top layers hide everything beneath. And adjusting a layer opacity will reveal what's on the bottom layers. Similarly, fill functions the same way, retaining layer effects while hiding the actual layer images themselves. We can group layers in the same way as Photoshop, and we can also parent layers. By holding Alt and clicking in between. One thing to note in Photopea is that it does not have the cursor icon change for parenting. So if you're holding Alt, you're going to have to really be accurate clicking between the layers, because it won't show you when it's hovering exactly over the dividing line. That's one thing I don't like about Photopea that Photoshop has. And that's pretty much it. The layer menu and using layers is actually fairly straightforward, but it affords us a huge amount of control and adjustability when it comes to image editing and digital painting that we're going to cover in future videos. So if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe for more weekly content, and don't forget to follow my Instagram at SirJohnTheHo for daily updates on my hobby content. Until next time, happy hobbying.